Merhaba sevgili Dilbilim severler. Bugün 93.'sünü düzenlediğimiz İzmir Dilbilim Buluşmalarına hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün konuşmacımız Orta Doğu Teknik Üniversitesi Bilişsel Bilimler Anabilim Dalı doktora öğrencisi Batuhan Karataş. Hoş geldiniz.
Hoş bulduk.
Batuhan Hocam aynı zamanda 9 Eylül'den Dil Bilim bölümünden lisans mezunu, bizden mezun. Negative Dependencies and Intervention Effects in Turkish başlıklı konuşmasını yapacak bize. Dilediğiniz zaman başlayabilirsiniz.
Tamam hocam, sağ olun. Şöyle, bu sunum zaten benim hemen hemen yani neredeyse tez savunmasında kullandığım slaytların aynısı sayılır. Yani özetle işte tezimi özetlemeye çalışacağım burada. Müsaadenizle ben sunumu İngilizce hazırlamıştım. Aynı biçimde yapmak istiyorum. Hani hiç ezber bozmayayım diyerekten. Başka
Olur.
da bir şey yoksa ben başlayayım artık yavaştan. Okay. All right. So, hello everyone again. In this presentation, I will try to summarize, heavily summarize my thesis work. Okay, so, which is about negative dependencies and intervention effects in Turkish. Okay, so, let me start with the outline. So we're going to start with an intro, then we're going to move on to the descriptive part, then we're going to focus on the main problem that we try to tackle in our work, and then we're going to end with the conclusion and discussion part, of course. In my thesis work, we had two goals. The first was to understand the general properties, like descriptive properties of negative dependencies in Turkish, of course. And then we came across another problem that is called intervention effects on negative dependencies. And we also tried to understand that. I'm specifying intervention effects on negative dependencies, and it's because it turns out that the term intervention effects is used in other areas of grammar as well. So, I'm just specifying. I think it refers to a configuration where there's like an intervener. So there's like a licensor, licensee. If there's something that is interrupting this licensing process, it tends to be called some form of intervention effect. And we're going to look at intervention effects on negative dependencies. Okay. So, well, what are negative dependencies? Negative dependencies are elements that require some kind of negation in a structure, such as, hiçbir, kimse, any, ever, these kinds of elements. So there are some subcategories of negative dependencies. We're going to take a look at two of those. We see in one a negative polarity item example. John did not read anything is well formed, but John read anything is not, of course. In two we see a negative concord item example. John hiçbir şey okumadı is well formed, whereas John hiçbir şey okudu is terrible. So naturally you may ask the question here, right? Okay, they seem to behave equivalently, right? Both seem to require some form of negation. So why are they different, or how are they different? And the answer to that gets actually a little bit complicated because there is a debate on the nature of the distinction between negative polarity items, negative concord items, and so on. But there seems to be at least one descriptive difference between them, and it is that negative concord items can signal negation on their own, at least in some configurations, whereas negative polarity items cannot signal negation. I tried to illustrate it in 3 and 4. So who did you see can be answered with no one, right? Like a typical negative quantifier, but it cannot be answered with anyone. Anyone does not have the capacity to signal negation on its own. But in Turkish example, in 4, we see that kimi gördün can be answered with hiç kimse. So in short, pure negative polarity items like anyone cannot signal negation on its own, but negative concord items can. Its difference from a negative quantifier is that negative quantifiers are always self-licensing. They do not ever need like negation or something, and they can cause double negation, but negative concord items tend to require licensing, and they do not cause double negation. Okay, so with that, let me just move on. Okay, so what are the research questions regarding negative dependence or negative dependencies? So all those research questions can be summarized with the trees that we see in 5 and 6. So in 5, we have something like John did not see anything. In 6, we have did John see anything, right? So the question is this: why? Why does not license anything? Or why does did license anything? Or why does anything require such licensing to begin with? Or what kind of mechanism licensing is going on there? Like, what is it, like a C commenting, something syntactic, maybe some form of feature, maybe something semantic or pragmatic going on? That's another question. What kind of mechanism is there? And the last question is, what happens when the dependency requirement is not met? Basically, what happens when the sentence is ill-formed? Like, do we have a syntactically ill-formed structure? Do we have a semantically or pragmatically old structure? Something like that. Those are the questions. Of course, there have been many attempts to answer some or all of these questions, and one of those, which is a relatively prominent and still relevant idea, comes from Ladusau's work, and it's the idea that is called downward entailment. So downward entailment is essentially a set to subset truth-preserving entailment. Basically, we have a main expression, and if the subset expression is entailed by that main expression, it is downward entailment. We can see an example of this idea in 7. So Harry does not attend a class entails Harry does not attend a physics class, right? Because, I mean, for Harry does not attend a class to be true, let's assume that this is attending a class. Harry has to be outside, right? With respect to such a model, Harry is not attending any kind of class, of course. So Harry does not attend a physics class, chemistry class, biology class, it doesn't matter. The next sentence will be entailed. So hence, as we're going essentially downward, and we're entailing in a downward fashion, the idea is called downward entailment. Similar behavior is also present in 7b. Every scientist who has done a research hates the chore, entails every scientist who has done a physics research hates the chore. The modeling of this sentence is a bit more complicated, but the idea is the same. There is downward entailment, and Ladusau proposes that negative polarity items are well formed when they are licensed by a downward entailing operator or in a downward entailing environment. So his prediction is that if we put like element like an any in such sentences, the sentence is going to be well formed, and it is. I mean, for instance, Harry does not attend any class is well formed, or every scientist who has done any research hates the chore is well formed again. That's the idea. Of course, as with any theory, it has some complications that I'm not going to go over all of them here for obvious reasons. But one of those is the fact that there are some downward entailing environments that do not license negative polarity items. At least some of those, some negative polarity items. To an illustration of that idea is given in 8. So niemand, which is a Dutch correspondence of no one, is able to license ook maar iets. Excuse my Dutch pronunciation. So ook maar iets, which is proposed to be a negative polarity item, is well formed when it is licensed by a downward entailing operator, niemand, no one. But niet iedereen, not everyone, which is also argued to be a downward entailing operator, doesn't license it. So we seem to be overgeneralizing by stating that downward entailing operators license MPIs. We have a counter evidence here, right? Okay. To capture such instances, to account for some of the problems that the downward entailing idea faces, Van der Wooden, based on similar work, proposes that downward entailment belongs to a negative hierarchy that seems to be present in natural language. And this negative hierarchy, negation hierarchy, is based on the set theoretic laws called De Morgan laws, which is about negation, intersection, and union operators that we're all familiar with from set theory, right? Okay, so it is argued that there are 4 levels to negation hierarchy, anti-morphic being the strongest, anti-additive being 1 level weaker, downward entailment being further weaker, and non-vertical being the weakest. For our purposes, anti-morphic and non-vertical levels are not that critical. We've already talked about downward entailment, so I'm just going to focus on the anti-additivity idea. Okay, so what is anti-additivity, or what are anti-additive functions? In short, any function that satisfies the condition that we see above is anti-additive. We see an illustration of that in 9. No man escaped or got killed entails no man escaped and no man got killed, right? For the first part of 9a to be true, escape and got killed sets both have to be empty, right? So with respect to such a model, no man escaped and no man got killed is also true, and vice versa. No man escaped and no man got killed also entails no man escaped or got killed. So the indication here is that no man satisfies the requirement of being an anti-additive operator. So this in essence, is the idea of anti-additivity. If it satisfies this condition here, it's an anti-additive operator. So why have I talked about all of this, like negation hierarchy and so on? It is to make sense of the generalization that we see in 10. So the licensor question regarding Turkish negative concord items. We can use the term negative dependence if you want to be more, theory neutral here. It doesn't matter. I'm just using the terms that we use in the thesis. So Turkish negative concord items such as kimse, hiç, hiçbir şey can be licensed by anti-additive operators like sız, ma, değil, yok. There may be some more, but I'm not sure if there are more anti-additive operators. Also, question operator that needs to be on the verb. So let us see what our description tries to capture. So anti-additivity test for Turkish. Kitap veya kalem getirmeksizin okula geldim. Entails kitap getirmeksizin okula geldim ve kalem getirmeksizin okula geldim, right? Because essentially at least kitap veya kalem getirmeksizin okula geldim means neither a book nor a pencil has been brought. And with respect to such a model, the right part is also true, and again, vice versa. So this means that sız or perhaps maksız, as Murat Hoca mentioned earlier in the defense, that item might constitute an anti-additive function or an anti-additive domain. And the prediction of our generalization is that if we put a negative concord item there, it's going to be well formed, and it is. For instance, hiçbir kalem getirmeksizin okula geldim is well formed, and our description, at least the first part, tries to capture that. So the second part, question test, right? Can hiçbir öğrenciye yardım etti mi? Is, well formed, sure. Can hiçbir öğrenciye mi yardım etti? Does not make much sense. And can mı hiçbir öğrenciye yardım etti? Is possibly even worse. So the idea here is that it seems that question or interrogative environments can license them, but for some reason there seem to be a further constraint, and it's that the question operator needs to be either on the verb or like the predicative element. Okay, nice. So let me just briefly summarize this descriptive part. So Turkish negative dependence seem to require anti-additive domains or interrogative domains, but the question operator needs to be on the verb. But naturally, further unification of the proposal in 10 is required, right? Why? Because it is, at least at this point, unclear what kind of relationship there is between anti-additive domains and question domains, especially considering that question domains are not sufficient to license these sentences, right? They need to be on the verb for some reason, indicating that there might be some form of syntactic constraint or perhaps some form of scope constraint. So we need a way to unify those. One possibility would be that there are some researchers that suggest that question structures might be construed, interpreted as, or categorized as downward entailing. So if that idea has some merit to it, then maybe we might find some ways to connect the ideas of anti-additivity and question structures. But at this point, it is not really straightforward. Okay, so with that, let me move on to the main problem that we try to understand in my thesis. Okay, so it turns out that presence of certain elements like universal quantifiers and coordination, some numerals, even because clauses in between the licensor and the licensee, if we have something like this, as we can see in the example here, appears to anti-license negative dependence in the sense that their presence is the reason that these negative dependents are not licensed. So an illustration of this intervention effect phenomena. So when Fred speaks French, John doesn't always understand anything. So this sentence, I'm not a native speaker, but this sentence is even terrible to me. So similarly in 13b, John didn't drink wine and any coffee. Why, right? Everything seems to be in order, but for some reason, these sentences cannot be really interpreted. We can state that, okay, there cannot be anything here, anything in between the licensor and the licensee, but the problem actually gets more complicated. So as we can see in 14, not every element is an intervener. So for instance, when Fred speaks French, it's not the case that anyone understands anything. Okay, this is fine. John didn't drink wine or any coffee. That's also fine. Now the question is this, why, right? Okay, so it seems that anyone, for instance, doesn't cause intervention, but always does, or doesn't cause intervention, but and does. What exactly is going on, right? That question, in essence, characterizes the intervention effects problem. Okay, so of course, intervention effects are also present in Turkish negative dependence as well. For instance, in 15A, we see that her hoca hiçbir öğrenciye güvenmedi is ill-formed, or at least it doesn't have the intervention configuration reading, right? Not every reading is not possible for any speaker, but it seems that there are some speakers that allow this sentence to be interpreted under the reading, which can be thought as like, no teacher trusted any student. That's about quantifier properties of Turkish. Basically, to get that reading, universal quantifier moves above negation. That is not a intervention configuration. So if you're one of those speakers that allow this sentence to be interpreted under such reading, that is fine. I mean, it's just about scope properties of negation. But the intervention configuration where universal quantifier is below negation is not allowed for anyone. Similarly in 15B, hiçbir hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi, or hiçbir hoca ve can gelmedi for some reason, again, ill-formed, and we can attribute those to intervention effects, at least on the surface. Okay, so, of course, again, there have been some attempts to account for these intervention effects. Immediate scope constraint of line barger, or ISC for short, is one of the earliest accounts of intervention effects. Immediate scope constraint essentially states that there cannot be logical elements in between the licensor and the licensee. So if you have a negation here, you have a negative polarity item here, there will not be any logical elements in between those. However, as was pointed out in many places in the literature, this theory, this idea seems to have many complications, especially with respect to overgeneration. It has some non-trivial overgeneration problems, so I'm not going to get into too much details of immediate scope constraint, but the reason that I wanted to mention immediate scope constraint is that besides Kellepir's PhD work, which utilizes this notion, this idea of immediate scope constraint, intervention effects in Turkish negative dependence are not really well studied. There aren't many studies. I don't even know if there's any other study besides Kellepir's work that tries to tackle these intervention effects. The point here is that if it is truly the case that Kellepir's study is the only work that tries to account for intervention effects, and if her works utilizes immediate scope constraint, which itself faces some meaningful empirical challenges, then we have a gap in the literature, right? Because we don't really understand, we don't really have studies that tries to understand this work that doesn't have at least some meaningful complications. So we have a gap, and that is hopefully where we come in. I mean, hopefully, we'll see. So to account for the intervention effects, we've utilized Kierkegaard's earlier work, Scholar Implicature Account of Intervention Effects by Kierkegaard. So according to Kierkegaard, negative polarity items or negative dependence are different from non-negative dependence in that negative dependence triggers subdomain alternatives, essentially, again, subset expressions. And these subset expressions are integrated into the overall meaning of the sentence. And these are non-cancelable, so they are always present, basically. So because of these alternatives, negative dependence need to be in downward entailing context that we've seen earlier. And if they are not, they are going to cause logical contradictions. I'm going to skip some, hows and whys here to make things simpler, but essentially negative dependence or negative polarity items need to be in downward entailing context due to the fact that they trigger these subdomain alternatives. So what are these subdomain alternatives, right? So let me try to briefly illustrate them. So in 16 we have a sentence called sentence like there aren't cookies left. Okay, good, typical. So it has the assertion or the bare meaning that can be thought as there are no cookies left, right? It doesn't have any alternatives because there aren't any negative polarity items here. So the overall meaning is equivalent to the assertion. However, in 17, we see that there aren't any cookies left has a more complicated meaning representation. So it has a roughly equivalent assertion to 16. All right, there are no cookies left, but it also triggers these alternatives. So subdomain alternatives. For instance, like there are no cookies left here would be a subdomain alternative that there are no cookies left. There are no cookies left in the kitchen. There are no cookies left in the fridge, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that these alternatives, when they are in a combined manner, it will be integrated into the overall meaning, which is going to give us the overall meaning that we see in 17C. So something like there are no cookies left, plus there are no cookies left basically anywhere. And this idea also tries to capture the fact that the presence of negative polarity items seem to cause like stronger statements, right? There aren't any cookies left appear to entail there aren't cookies left. So this idea is captured with this system in the sense that the overall meaning of 17C is stronger than 16C, right? So Kierkegaard tries to capture the fact that negative polarity items or sentences with negative polarity items are stronger than non-negative polarity item counterparts in this manner, because basically we have there are no cookies left anywhere, which is non-cancelable, is always going to be present. So it has that stronger intuition. That's the idea. In short, again, negative polarity items need to be in downward entailing context because of these alternatives. Again, I'm skipping some details here. So what about intervention effects? Kierkegaard notes that, based on similar work, some elements in natural language seem to belong to a natural scale. So, for instance, some, maybe few, many, most, every. These elements seem to sit on a scale, like also, or, and. For instance, the idea here is that every is a strong scalar item, whereas some/a is weak, in the sense that, again, for instance, let's say every student came to the school entails some student came to the school, right? But some student came to the school does not necessarily entail every student came to the school. So that's the idea. So every is stronger in that sense. Kierkegaard goes on to state that scalar items trigger scalar implicatures, depending on what kind of structure they find themselves in. And the idea here is that this assertion, the bare meaning, plus these scalar implicatures, is called the strengthened meaning. And this, let's say, the level of representation, this overall meaning, is what licenses NPIs. So for our purposes, what matters is the following. When a strong scalar element is present in a downward entailing context, it is argued to disrupt the downward entailingness of the structure, thus causing logical contradiction. So basically, for our purposes, what matters is this. Negative polarity items need to be in a downward entailing context, otherwise they cause logical contradictions. And since strong scalar items are argued to disturb the downward entailment property of some operators like negation, if there's also negative polarity item in that sentence, the sentence is bound to be ill-formed because it'll be a pseudo downward entailing environment. That is the idea. Okay, again, I'm skipping some details here. So this idea directly captures 17 and 18, or more specifically, the asymmetry that we see in 17 and 18, right? Because when Fred speaks French, John doesn't always understand anything. We predict this to be ill-formed because the presence of always, which is a universal quantifier, will disturb the downward entailment of this structure. Thus, anything will find itself in a pseudo-downward entailing environment, and it's going to cause logical contradiction. And Kierkegaard argues that such logical contradictions cause sentences to be ill-formed. Naturally, the same argument can be extended to 17b. John didn't drink wine and any coffee is ill-formed. Why? Because we have a strong scalar item and it's going to disturb the downward entailing property of not. So any finds itself in a, again, pseudo downward entailing environment. So it's going to cause the sentence to be logically contradictory. So the sentence will be ill-formed. Basically, we do not want any kind of strong scalar element in a structure, or more specifically, under the scope of negation. This also explains why 18 is well formed now, right? So when Fred speaks French, it's not the case that anyone understands anything. It's fine because there aren't any strong scalar items here. So it's not the case that anyone understands anything. There isn't anything. Perhaps negative polarity items are not even considered as strong scalar items. But for our purposes, what matters is that there isn't any strong scalar item, so the sentence is predicted to be well formed. A similar argument can be extended to 18b. John didn't drink wine or any coffee is well formed because or is a weak scalar item. So it's not going to disturb the downward entailing property of not. Okay. So how does this idea do when it comes to the Turkish data that we try to account for, right? So for her, the Turkish universal quantifier, or all of those universal quantifiers, the analysis at least somewhat directly follows. So her hoca hiçbir öğrenciyi sevmez does not have the intervention configuration reading because there is a universal quantifier that sits below negation. It's going to disturb the downward entailing property of this negation. So the negative dependent that's below that will find itself in a pseudo downward entailing environment. So the sentence is predicted to be ill-found, which is what we see, as we can see in 19, right? Okay. However, when it comes to the ve intervention in Turkish, things get a bit more complicated. So let us take a look at the examples in 20. Hiçbir hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi sounds backward, right? Hiçbir hoca ve her öğrenci gelmedi, again similar. But hiçbir hoca ve hiçbir öğrenci gelmedi is fine. I can even just continue with the noun phrases. Hiçbir hoca, hiçbir öğrenci ve hiçbir görevli gelmedi, and so on and so forth. So it seems we can combine negative, concord, or negative polarity items. All right, so the implication here is that 20A and B is in line with the scalar implicature theory because we have a seemingly strong scalar item and the sentences are ill-formed. Okay, but 20C is not predicted by the theory. So how can we account for this? Let us first note that the noun phrase coordination under negation seems to have a specific constraint. Her hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi, or Can ve her hoca gelmedi. How are these sentences? They're not really well formed, right? So if my intuition, and after doing some informal tests on other native speakers as well, if our intuition is on the right track, the indication is that we have a specific NP-DP coordination constraint when it's under negation in Turkish. So to capture this intuition, we propose 22. An NP of class A, like an existential quantifier, can be coordinated with an NP of class B, like a universal quantifier, only if the sentence is non-negative. So for instance, that is why, her hoca ve iki öğrenci geldi. That's fine because, it's not in a negative environment. Otherwise, an NP of class A can only be coordinated with another NP of class A. Existential quantifier plus existential quantifier is fine when it's under negation. For instance, iki öğrenci ve üç hoca gelmedi. That's also fine. So the descriptive constraint that we see in 22 tries to capture this intuition of native speakers. All right, cool. So how does this help us with the intervention effects, right? And it helps us in that it allows us to attribute the ill-formed nature of 20A and B to 22 here. That's the idea. So the reason for this is twofold. First is that it allows us to reduce the amount of data that we need to account for as intervention effects, right? Now we are just saying that there's a distinct independent constraint in Turkish when it comes to negation and and. The other reason, the main reason is that, as we can see in 20C, V does not seem to cause the expected intervention effect to begin with. So due to that, we're attributing 20A and B to 22, a different constraint. All right, good. But as you might imagine, this does not exactly solve the problem. Why? Because we still have some seemingly strong scalar element that is not causing the intervention effect. So how can we account for that? And we can account for that if we take a look at the behavior of and or ve when it's under negation in Turkish. So Turkish ve under negation does not have the predicted either or reading that is present in languages like English. So for instance, Dean did not drink whiskey and wine appears to have the salient reading that can be thought as Dean either drank whiskey or wine. Okay, so one of those has to happen, right? But in Turkish, we don't have that. Can öğrencilere ve hocalara güvenmedi has the neither nor reading. Can ne öğrencilere ne hocalara güvendi. So as anyone who's familiar with basic logical representations and so on can see, it seems that Turkish ve for some reason appears to behave like as if it is logical or when it's under negation. So yes, it is ve, it is and, but for some reason it seems to behave like as if it is the logical or logical disjunction when it's under negation. The reason is that, so for instance, not A or B is true if and only if A and B are both false, right? Neither nor. So that's the interpretation that we get when ve is under negation. So we have some form of intuition that seems to suggest that Turkish ve is truly interpreted as a logical or for some reason. So to capture that, okay, we seem to get logical or reading when Turkish ve is under negation. All right, good. So to capture this, we propose the following. A description of Turkish ve under negation. Turkish scalar coordinator ve is interpreted as the logical disjunction when it is under negation. Again, for some reason, it is unclear why it would behave like that. But if the intuitions are correct, it truly does, right? It's equivalent to how logical or behaves when it's under negation. So how does this help us? If our assumption is correct and if it truly behaves like logical or, if ve truly behaves like logical or under negation, how does it help us? It helps us because if Turkish ve is not a strong scalar item, right, it behaves like logical or, and logical or is a weak scalar item. So the scalar implicator theory does not predict the intervention effects to begin with. It's not a strong scalar item, it's a weak scalar item. So hiçbir hoca ve hiçbir öğrenci gelmedi is actually predicted to be well formed. So let me just summarize everything to simplify it as best as I can. 20A and B are ill-formed because of an independent constraint specific to Turkish V and negation, which is given in 22. Basically, we cannot combine two different kinds of NPs, whatever that term kind turns out to be. Hiçbir hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi is ill-formed because of that. And 20C is well-formed because V is not a strong scalar item. So the theory does not predict it to be ill-formed anyway. It should be well-formed because it's not going to cause the intervention effect. It's not going to disturb the downward entailing property of this negation. So, okay, so now that I've talked about everything, I hope things made at least a little bit of sense. I have so many more slides if anyone wants to get into more details, but let me just bring this presentation to a conclusion. Descriptively speaking, Turkish negative dependence appear to require anti-additive environments or interrogative environments, but the question operator needs to be on the verb or, the predicative element. When it comes to intervention effects, the scalar implicator theory of Kierkegaard, although relatively complicated, if I'm being honest, is able to account for the intervention effect problem, right? But we need to make some assumptions regarding the data, such as the way intervention. I should point out here that it might seem as if it is the case that we're playing with the data so that we can fit the data to the theory, which, is a problematic behavior, naturally. But that is not exactly what we're doing here, because we're not proposing manipulating the data, or we're not proposing those constraints as an ad hoc solution so that we can fit the data to the theory. We're trying to at least argue on different empirical grounds. So, for instance, 22 is argued on different grounds, so is the idea 25. But when we combine these, the scalar implicator theory can at least relatively straightforwardly account for the data that we want it to account for. Okay. Of course, there are more data that the theory can account for, as we discussed in the thesis and hopefully in the paper as well. But before I move on, I should point out some complications that our theory, our work faces. One of those is that for practical reasons, we utilized an earlier version of Kierkegaard's theory because his later versions is, if I'm being honest, even more complicated, and it's a really long book. And since it's a master's work, we didn't have the time. And it turns out that his earlier work is sufficient enough to capture the data that we needed it to capture. So we didn't get into that. But of course, more recent work needs to be adapted to see how far it can go, because apparently it is argued at least that the earlier version has some complications that is proposed to be fixed by the more recent work. Another complication is about question structures. So it turns out that intervention effects seem to be also present in question structures. For instance, her hoca hiçbir öğrenciye yardım etti mi? I don't even understand what the sentence is saying, but in question structures, it is argued that there aren't really entailments anyway. So how does scalar implicator theory captures this intervention effect? It is also a mystery at this point. Again, there may be some ways to capture this idea if we can somehow find a way to integrate the interrogative environments with, downward entailment. Perhaps there may be ways, but at this point, it is unclear. So those would be the two main complications of our theory. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for being here and listening to me. Artık Türkçe'ye geri dönebiliriz herhalde. Çok teşekkür ederim tekrar dinlediğiniz için. Varsa sorularınız, dediğim gibi bir sürü detaylı yer var. İlgilenen olursa anlatmaya dilerim. Sağ olun.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz Batuhan Hocama. Sorusu olan dinleyicilerimiz yazabilirler ya da doğrudan el kaldır butonunu kullanabilirler. Kamera ve mikrofon açabilirler. Emeğine sağlık Batuhan.
Teşekkür ediyorum efendim. Sağ olun. Yok gibi galiba.
Chatbox'ta.
Neden dilbilim falan diyorsun.
Değil mi? Evet. Ne gerek vardı?
Ya ben bir data soracağım sana. Az önce Serkan Hoca'yla da konuştuk da o da özelden de konuşuyoruz. Trafikteyim şimdi. Ondan soramıyorum diyor.
Tamam.
Bu her hoca ve hiçbir öğrenci gelmedi. Fena değil gibi o data ya.
Bana da iyi geldi o data ya.
Her hoca ve hiçbir öğrenci gelmedi. Fena değil mi?
Bir dakika dur. Her hoca ve
Tamam.
2 öğrenci gelmedi. Pardon. Neydi o data? Her hoca ve bir
Her
saniye.
hoca
Hemen
ve
geri
iki
alıyorum.
öğrenci gelmedi.
Ha, hiçbir hoca ve 2 öğrenci
Hah,
gelmedi. Çok özür
iki
dilerim.
öğrenci
Bir hoca
gelmedi.
ve 2 öğrenci gelmedi.
Şu 20A mı hocam?
Hı hı.
Evet evet.
Hmm.
Yani tabii bir judgment farkı olabilir de sanki bunu böyle şey diye okusan oluyor gibi. Yani
Bir söyleyeyim hocam, belki ben de şey yapıyor olabilirim, evet.
in the sense that there are two specific students like Batu and Koray,
Hmm.
and everybody knows about them.
Ha,
So işte
anladım.
hiçbir hoca ve 2 öğrenci gelmedi. Then it makes sense. It sounds grammatical. I think.
Olabilir. Yok, olabilir. Sanırım Umut Hoca da benzer bir şey demişti. Belki bu datayı şey yapmama gerek yoktu ama olabilir. Hocam orada benzer durumlar var. Mesela bazı speaker'lar şeyi de kabul ediyordu galiba. Datayı da tam hatırlamıyorum ki şimdi, yalan olmasın. Her
Ya bir de
hoca ve...
dataların şöyle bir sıkıntısı var. Bunlar hep böyle scope'la
Evet, aynen öyle.
çalışıyor ya. Bir
Evet, aynen
yerden
öyle.
sonra thank you very much.
Hı,
Leyla Hoca da özelden şeyden yazmış, gruba yazmış herhalde. I
tamam.
agree with Murat on the judgment diye.
Sağ olun
E,
hocam.
Şöyle scope'la çalıştığı için
Hı
bir
hı.
yerden sonra körleşiyorsun dataya. Çünkü
Evet.
scope dataları böyle çok tehlikeli datalar yani.
Evet, evet, farkındayım hocam. Çok denk geldim
E,
zaten bu duruma.
sen bir şey söylüyordun bu arada.
Ben mi?
Evet.
Ha, evet hocam, yanlış hatırlamıyorsam iki öğrencinin böyle spesifik diyelim okumasını, o spesifik okumasında bazı durumlarda müsaade ediliyor. Nedense ben çok alamıyorum onu. Ama galiba olabiliyor. Onun detaylarına zaten bakmayı planlıyoruz biz de, hani o scope potansiyellerinden bir emin olup ondan sonra paper'a girişeceğiz. En başta aldığımız sezdirimler anlaşılan düşündüğümüz kadar stabil değil. O scope potansiyellerine bakıp ondan sonra bir bakılabilir, evet.
Sanki burada variable'ları belirleyip böyle bir
Hı
judgment
hı.
test mi yapacaksınız? Öyle bir şey mi?
Galiba öyle bir şey yapacağız, evet. Ya çünkü ben halen daha doğru düzgün yorumlayamıyorum ne demek istediğini cümlenin.
Evet.
Ama anlaşılan yorumlanabiliyor. O yüzden ona bakmak lazım.
Bana da iyi geldi mesela. Her
Tamam,
hoca
aynen.
iki öğrenci gelmedi de specificity koyduğuna yani Koray ve Batu
Hangi cümlede, hangi cümlede?
her hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi var ya.
Yok, hiçbir hoca ve 2 öğrenci
Yok,
gelmedi
bir dakika. Hiçbir
bahsediyoruz.
hoca ve iki
Hı,
öğrenci
bu
gelmedi.
karmaşıklıklarda çok
Bu
oluyor.
arada de soru işaretli değil. Ondan çok daha iyi. Her hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmedi. Bu da iyi geliyor bana.
Öyle mi?
Yok, bu mesela diğerinden daha kötü.
Bana hiçbir anlam ifade etmiyor. Ne yorum alıyorsunuz hocam siz burada, her hoca ve iki öğrenci gelmediden?
Bu kötü bir tümce.
Bana da çok kötü de.
Bence
Bütün
soru
hocalar,
işareti de değil.
Evet,
bütün
ben de.
hocalar gelmedi. İki
Efendim?
öğrenci de gelmedi okuması var bende.
Bir daha söyler misiniz hocam? Pardon, duyamadım.
İşte bütün hocalar gelmedi ama iki öğrenci de gelmedi.
Ha, hocaların hiçbirisi gelmedi mi yorumu var burada.
Hı hı.
Hayır.
Tamam.
Bende o yorum da var.
O Universal Quantifier'ı negation üzerine scope alabiliyor hocam o. Var ya öyle nadiren yapabilenlerden. Tamam,
Evet.
o varsa o sorun değil. O bize sorun çıkartmıyor
Aramızda var
zaten.
öyle. Aymire var mesela. Aramızda
Evet.
onu yapanlar.
O sorun değil. O yorumla müsaade ediyor zaten. Bizim teoride
Ben
onunla
çok
ilgili
devreye
sıkıntı yok.
girmedim hocam. Beni zorbaladığınız için.
O sorun değil. O zaman hiçbir yorum alıyoruz zaten. O çok
Mira
sıkıntı olan
senin
bir şey.
yerine hiçbir yorumunu ben yaptım bu sefer.
Evet.
Evet hocam, öyle oldu biraz.
Leyla Hoca mikrofonunu açtı bir arada. Bir şey soracak herhalde. Ona bir...
Hocam buyurun.
Hocam buyurun.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch to English if you
Sure
guys
hocam.
don't mind.
Sure.
So in my dissertation, I had mentioned and shown that downward entailing contexts don't actually license NPIs
Okay.
and free choice items. Of course, the yes/no question morpheme that takes scope over the entire proposition is an outlier in the licensing context. Given that, given that downward entailment is a very limited, if at all, possibility to license negative polarity items and free choice items for that matter. How does the interaction of downward entailment and scalar implicature sort of work together to account for the data you're showing, right?
Okay
I mean,
hocam.
if downward entailment is not working,
Hı hı.
how does the interaction of downward entailment plus scalar account for the data?
Hocam, amazing question. To be honest, as I tried to be careful here, in Turkish
Mhm.
at least, downward entailment already does not really license. It's not
Mhm.
sufficient enough to license
Correct.
Turkish data.
Yes.
There are
I
many
have
downward
just, yeah. It's in my thesis before Meltem 2001.
Okay, I have not seen it. Okay, I will definitely take a look at it hocam.
Understandable, because the title of the thesis is indefinite, so nobody thinks about negative
Yeah.
polarity items. Because I treat NPIs and free choice items actually as variables,
All right. Okay.
right? And
Sure,
that's
of course,
because
of
of the quantificational force that they
Yeah.
exhibit under negation.
Yeah, okay. All right,
Mhm.
hocam. So again, great question.
Yeah.
So as I tried to talk about it, it turns out at least anti-additivity, when it's properly anti-additive, seems to be sufficient when it's present for licensing negative concord items or negative polarity items in Turkish, or whatever negative dependent they turn out to be. And as you mentioned, the question particle seems to be an outlier, but that's also present. So that's what we try to capture with the descriptive work. When it comes to Kierkegaard's idea, if a sentence loses its downward entailing property, by definition, it also loses its anti-additivity force due to the way those hierarchies defined. You know, where was it? Here. So if a sentence loses its downward entailment due to the presence of a strong scalar item, it's also not going to satisfy the requirements of being an anti-additive or anti-morphic. So therefore, it's predicted to be ill-formed. So if you're also asking how does it exactly disturb the downward entailment property of those elements, I can try to get into the details a little bit. Hocam, do we have the time? Can I go into the details? Is it okay? Great.
Of
Sure.
course.
Okay. So let me find the I'm trying to see if I can find it.
Zoom bu gece bize ait. 12'ye kadar buradayız. Sabah
Okay,
kadar
tamam.
buradayız.
Süper, tamam. Nasıldı? Herhalde buradan anlatabilirim diye düşünüyorum. Okay, so scalar implicatures are integrated as in 19, hocam. At least it is argued to be integrated like this. So we have the bare meaning of 18 here. For instance, not everyone understands things would have a bare meaning that would correspond to, like, I'm not sure if I have given it here. Let me see if I have something better. No, okay, let's just stick to here. It has basically not everyone understands things in its bare form would be true if there is at least one person who didn't understand things is true, right? Basic, okay. But Kierkegaard proposes that the presence of this every under negation triggers its weak scalar counterpart. So some is triggered. But not some is not entailed by not every, right? So he states that these expressions that are not entailed by the assertion, these scalar implicatures that are not entailed by the assertion, will be negated before they are integrated into the overall meaning of the sentence to create these strengthened meanings. Basically, what happens when we have not everyone understands things is that we have not everyone understands things, and not there's at least one person who understands things. So he tries to argue that this is the actual meaning. This is the strengthened meaning of this sentence. Due to this property, the sentence is naturally not a downward entailing context anymore. And if it's not a downward entailing context, even for languages like Turkish, which downward entailing is already not a sufficient condition for licensing, the sentence is predicted to be ill-formed because basically that negative polarity item tries to be interpreted in a non-downward entailing environment, because there's at least one person who understands things is triggered due to the presence of this strong scalar item.
Thank you.
Sure, Jem.
Something to think about. I don't want to bore people, but it would be interesting to see in other languages whether
Absolutely.
this works, where the downward entailment context is being disrupted due to a strong scalar integer of logical operators.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing worth interesting to look into is whether your account can extend to free choice items like
Absolutely.
headhanger, because they need licensors as well.
True. We haven't we haven't started analyzing them due to, of course, time constraint, but I want to look at them in my PhD work.
Just a
Okay, thanks.
suggestion.
Yes, of course, Hocam. Thank you. I aim to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hocam. I appreciate it.
Eline diline sağlık.
Çok sağ olun hocam. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Güzel bir tez olmuş. Baştan sona okuyacağım bunu Batuş. Teşekkür ederiz.
Sağ olun hocam. Ben teşekkür ederim.
Pelin
Karacan.
Evet, mikrofonunu açabilirsin Pelin.
Açtım. İlk kez soru soruyorum İDÇ'de.
Evet.
Merhaba. Tebrik
Merhaba.
ederim. Çok güzel
Çok
bir
teşekkür
sunumdu.
ederim. Sağ
Teşekkür
olun.
ederiz. Ben de körleşmiş olabilirim data konusunda ama şu nasıl geliyor size? Can yabancılara ve her arkadaşına güvenmez.
Bana iyi geliyor.
Bana da fena
Bana da
gelmedi.
iyi geldi ve o aradığımız yani can yabancılara güvenmez. Yani hiçbir yabancıya
Hı hı.
ve her arkadaşına güvenmez. Yani bazılarına güvenir gibi bir anlam da çıkıyor
Hı hı.
bence. Bu tümce bana iyi geliyor. Bununla ilgili ne düşünüyorsunuz? Ya da
Bir şu
size
an
nasıl
oldu.
geliyor?
Can
Hiçbir
yabancıları ve her
yabancı da
arkadaşına
olabilir
güven.
ama her yabancı da olabilir.
Ben hiçbir yorumunu buradan almıyorum hiçbir türlü. Bende çıkmıyor ya Universal Quantifier Negation üzerine bende çıkmadığı için o hiçbir yorum hiçbir türlü mümkün değil bana.
Bu
Ama
hiçbir yabancıya güvenmiyor anlamı mı çıkmıyor sizde?
evet,
Yani
bende
can
hiç
yabancılara ve her arkadaşına güvenmez.
buradan hiçbir arkadaşına güvenmez yorumunu alabiliyor musunuz siz?
Hayır.
Ha tamam süper.
Yani
Ben de almıyorum. Okey tamam. Okey tamam.
tamam, bu beklediğimiz bir sonuç mu?
Ha, yok o değişiyor. Kimi ana dil konuşucuları Türkçe'de bir biçimde artık nasıl oluyorsa ben de o dialect farkı diyelim basitçe. Universal Quantifier Negation üzerine çıkmasına müsaade ediyor ve hani bu hiçbir yorumunu alabiliyorlar. Ben onlardan birisi değilim. Ama bu cümle yani ondan bağımsız olarak galiba çok kötü değil. Can yabancılara ve her arkadaşına güvenmez. Yabancıların her birine güvenmez. Arkadaşların her birine güvenmez ama bazılarına güvenir gibi bir yorum potansiyeli var.
Evet, yani buradan ben şunu alıyorum. Yabancılara güvenmez, yani hiçbir yabancıya güvenmez. Her arkadaşına güvenmez, bazılarına güvenir gibi bir yorum alıyorum.
Ben onu almıyorum.
Yani can yabancılara ve her arkadaşına güvenmez gibi.
Yok bende o yok.
Senin sisteminle ilgili bir şey var mı? Pelin'in sormaya çalıştığı soru o galiba biraz da.
Eğer ki bu
Senin
yorum
sistemin bunu
varsa
predict ediyor mu?
Evet,
Evet.
evet, bununla ilgili ne söylüyor yani bu tümceyle ilgili?
Benim
Bunun dil bilgisel olduğunu kabul ederek soruyorum.
Kierkegaard'ın sistemi buna neredeyse hiç demez. Bu bizim yaptığımız nasıl diyeyim? O basit genelleme vardı ya hani işte Türkçe'de hani farklı tip NP'leri rahat rahat koordine edemiyoruz Türkçenin altındaki. Onunla ilgili bir sorun çıkartabilir bu. Eğer ki dediğin gibi ise işte dediğiniz gibi ise yani yabancılarının tamamını almıyorken hani yabancıların hiçbirine yardım etmiyor ve arkadaşlarının her birine değil ama bazılarına güvenmezdi değil mi? Öyle bir yorum alabiliyorsak o zaman
Evet.
bizim gidip o şeyi tekrar bir gözden geçirmemiz lazım o constraint'i. Çünkü bu sefer hiçbiri ve her'i birleştirebiliyorsunuz.
Evet, evet.
O olmaz. Yani onun olmaması lazım. Demek ki onunla ilgili bizim Murat Hoca'nın da dediği gibi şeye bakmak lazım. Bu çünkü mesela siz alıyorsunuz ben almıyorum falan. Bu da çok ilginç bir durum.
Evet, maalesef.
Evet yani o
Çok
yüzden
zor oluyor.
quantifier işleri girdiği zaman birazcık kabus gibi oluyor. Biz hani küçük bir informal test yaptık. Sorduğumuz hemen herkes bizimle aynı alınca biz de herhalde öyledir dedik ama öyle değilmiş anlaşılan. Ona göre tekrar şey yapacağız artık. Zaten
Ama burada
paper
tabii
yazdıklarım var.
kendi judgment'larına güvenerek gitmen gerekiyor. Çünkü işin anket kısmı başka bir şeye götürür seni yani.
Evet biliyorum.
Başka
Ondan
bir
da
yere
çok
götürür
korkuyorum.
seni yani.
Ondan da çok korkuyorum hocam. Ama
Yani
benim judgment'larım alırsak böyle.
çalıştığımız alanın işte şeyi de bu yani handikapı da bu.
Çok büyük bir
Maalesef
handikap.
böyle
Evet.
kendi judgment'larına güvenmek ve ondan hareket ederek devam etmek zorunda kalıyorsun. Yani çok
Evet.
böyle belirgin asimetriler yoksa judgment'lar arasında bence çok da sorun yok yani.
Evet. Bizim bölümdeki hocalar biliyorsunuz biraz seviyor şeyi. Hafiften anket temelli yapmayı. Sadece native speaker olarak bakmamayı. Ama bakacağım hocam. Çünkü anlaşılan düşündüğüm kadar stabil değil ve sadece kendi judgment'ım olduğunu düşündüğüm şeyden şundan da korkuyorum biraz. Observer's paradox. Hani zaten böyle olacağını düşünüyorum diye mi acaba öyle almıyorum diye hafiften korkmaya başladım artık. Biraz gene bir emin olmak istiyorum ben judgment'larımdan. Ondan sonra devam ederiz artık buna. Çünkü diğer türlü datayı açıklamakta biraz hani daha doğrusu şunu açıklamakta güçlük çekeriz. Yani bizim teorik bir şey olarak bir şey olmaz da bu sefer şunu açıklayamıyoruz. Neydi o? Ha bu sefer A ile B niye kötü? Bizim çalışmadan tamamen uzak bir yere gidiyor. Ha, zaten bizim teori 20C'nin düzgün olmasını bekliyor. Sıkıntı yok. Bizim için önemli olan o da A ve B ile ilgili hiçbir şey söyleyemiyor oluyoruz. O olur. Ona bakacağız artık.
Zaten 20 ay bakman lazım. Çünkü hakikaten iyi o tümce.
O iyi
Spesifik
ya.
Okey.
sonrası.
İyi.
Onun iyi olması dediğim
Bana
gibi
çok iyi.
normalde bize hiçbir sorun çıkartan bir durum değil onun iyi
İyi o
olması.
zaman sıkıntı
Aynen.
yok.
Hiç
Bunun
sıfır
açıklaması
sıkıntı.
varsa
Evet.
etrafından dolaşabiliyorsan.
Hiç sıfır sıkıntı. Sıfır. Gayet rahatız onunla ilgili.
Başka sorumuz
Teşekkür
yok.
ederim bu arada soru için.
Ben
Teşekkür.
teşekkür ederim tekrar sunum için. Kolay gelsin.
Sağ olun. Var mı başka?
Chatbox'tan teşekkürler geliyor.
Efendim ben teşekkür ediyorum dinlediğiniz için. Meltem Hoca'yı görüyorum galiba. Sağ olun hocam.
Başka soru ya da katkımız yoksa
Yok.
kapatabiliriz oturumu.
O zaman ben tekrar herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum gelip dinlediğiniz için.
Teşekkür
Yoksa başka bir
ediyoruz.
şey evet.
Kutlarım.
Keyifli, güzel bir sunumdu. Teşekkür ederiz. Çok şey öğrendik.
Sağ olun efendim.
Bugün de bilimlendik çok şükür.
Ben bedava bilgimi aldıysam gidebilir miyim artık hocam?
Tabii tertemiz evet.
O zaman
Sıfır efor.
Doğru.
Chatbox'tan teşekkürleri okuyabiliyorsun değil mi? Tek tek
Evet evet ben evet herkese ben de teşekkür ediyorum. Evet. Tüm hocamıza
Tamamdır.
ayrı,
Çok
Serhat.
teşekkür ediyoruz. O zaman önümüzdeki hafta doktor öğretim üyesi Mehmet Akkuş'u ağırlayacağız Artvin Çoruh Üniversitesi'nden. Doğu Karadeniz'de tehlike altında diller. 94.sünde buluşmak dileğiyle diyorum o zaman herkese. Kendinize çok iyi bakın. Hoşça
Görüşmek
kalın.
üzere. Sağ olun.
Görüşmek üzere.